Teachers who broke protocol to save lives? What was the fallout? The fire alarm during fourth period wasn't part of any drill schedule. I checked my phone to confirm because Principal Garrett had sent a mass email that morning reminding us there were no drills planned for the week, but the alarm was screaming and my 28 sophomore English students were looking at me expectantly, waiting for instructions. Standard protocol said to verify with the office before evacuating during testing week. State exams were sacred, interruptions meant invalidated scores, and Garrett had made it clear that maintaining test integrity was our top priority. My classroom phone was dead when I picked it up. No dial tone, just silence. Through the window, I could see actual smoke rising from the chemistry wing, thick and black and spreading faster than seemed possible. The alarm had been going for 30 seconds. 40. Protocol said, wait for confirmation. My gut said run. I grabbed the emergency door release and started herding students toward the exit while they were still asking if this was real or just another drill we were supposed to ignore. We made it to the parking lot before I saw that half the school was still inside. Other teachers were standing at their classroom doors looking confused, phones pressed to their ears, waiting for official word from the office that never came. The smoke was pouring out of the east entrance now, and I could hear shouting from inside the building. My colleague David Huang was standing in the doorway of the math wing with his AP Calculus class still seated at their desks, visible through the windows behind him, pencils moving across test booklets like nothing was wrong. I ran back inside. The smoke was thicker in the hallways, burning my throat and making my eyes water. David was on his classroom phone when I burst through his door, and he held up one finger telling me to wait while he tried to get through to the office. His students were coughing now, some of them covering their mouths with their shirts. I didn't wait for his permission. I hit the fire alarm pull station in his hallway and started physically pulling students out of their seats, shouting that we were evacuating immediately. David grabbed my arm and said I was contaminating the test environment, that we'd all be reported for violations. I shoved him off and kept moving students toward the door. Some of them were crying, others were frozen in their seats, and the smoke was getting worse by the second. Through the chaos, I heard an explosion from somewhere in the building. The chemistry lab. I'd learn later. Volatile materials that should have been properly stored but weren't. The blast took out part of the east wall and started a second fire that spread to the library within minutes. We got David's class out along with students from 2 other rooms whose teachers were still waiting for official confirmation. The parking lot was chaos now. Teachers and students streaming out of some exits while smoke poured from others. Emergency vehicles were arriving, firefighters running toward the building in full gear. Principal Garrett was standing near the front entrance with his phone out, looking shell-shocked as the building he'd run for 12 years burned in front of him. The final count came in around midnight. Everyone survived. 217 students and staff treated for smoke inhalation, 34 hospitalized, but everyone survived. The students who'd evacuated early, like my English class, were mostly fine. The ones who'd stayed in their classrooms waiting for permission had varying degrees of injury. David Huang's class had the worst of it, because his room was closest to the chemistry lab. 7 students ended up in ICU with severe respiratory damage. One girl, Melissa Park, spent 3 weeks in a medically induced coma. The investigation started before the fire was fully extinguished. State fire marshal, school district safety officers, insurance investigators, all descending on what was left of Lincoln High School. The chemistry lab had been running experiments with materials that weren't properly ventilated. The teacher, Gary Thornton, had been warned twice about his storage procedures, but claimed the district wouldn't fund proper cabinets. The phone system had gone down in the first 30 seconds of the fire because the main server was located directly below the chemistry lab. But the real investigation wasn't about what started the fire. It was about why half the school had stayed inside, while the building burned district policy they discovered had been revised 6 months earlier. During standardized testing periods, teachers were required to verify any emergency with the main office before evacuating. The policy was designed to prevent cheating and maintain test security. After an incident at another school where students had used a fake fire alarm to share answers, Principal Garrett had sent multiple emails emphasizing this policy in the weeks leading up to testing. 3 days after the fire, I was called into a meeting with Garrett, the district superintendent Dr. Patricia Vance, and their attorneys. They informed me that I was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into my violation of evacuation protocols. I'd failed to verify the emergency with the office. I'd contaminated multiple test environments by entering rooms and touching students who were mid-exam. I'd physically assaulted a colleague, David Huang, who'd been trying to follow proper procedures. The contaminated tests would all need to be invalidated and retaken, affecting over 100 students' scores and college applications. David filed a formal complaint against me that same day. He claimed I'd endangered students by creating panic and chaos in a situation that could have been handled calmly if everyone had followed protocol. His report detailed how I'd shoved him, how I'd screamed at students instead of maintaining order, how my actions had directly led to several students suffering injuries in the stampede to evacuate. He attached statements from 3 other teachers who said they'd been managing their classrooms appropriately until I'd interfered. The union rep assigned to my case was a 26-year veteran named Thomas Wu, who'd seen everything the district could throw at teachers. He sat in my kitchen 3 nights after the fire and laid out exactly how screwed I was. The district was building a case for termination with cause. which would mean losing my teaching license, my pension, everything I'd worked for in 9 years of teaching. They had documentation showing I'd received the protocol emails. They had security footage of me physically pulling David away from his classroom phone. They had testimony from multiple teachers saying I'd created the dangerous situation, not the fire. But Thomas also said we had a case if we wanted to fight. The phone system failure meant the protocol couldn't be followed even if teachers wanted to. The smoke was visible before I'd evacuated, making it a clear emergency. The students in my class had 0 injuries, while students who'd stayed behind had significant harm. He could get expert testimony about response times and evacuation procedures. The problem was that fighting would mean years of legal battles, public testimony, and almost certainly losing my job anyway while we waited for hearings and appeals. The media picked up the story within a week. Local news first, then regional, then national once they understood the angles. Teacher violates protocol during fire, students hospitalized after unauthorized evacuation. School district defends testing integrity policies. The comment sections were split between people calling me a hero and people saying I'd caused unnecessary chaos that could have been avoided if I'd just followed the rules like David Huang had tried to do. Melissa Park's parents hired an attorney before she was even out of her coma. They sued the district, the school, Principal Garrett, the chemistry teacher, and me personally. Their claim was that their daughter's injuries were directly caused by David Huang keeping his class inside during a fire, and that my intervention, while well-intentioned, had come too late to prevent her severe smoke inhalation. The legal theory was complicated, but boiled down to, everyone involved in the evacuation delay was liable for damages. My homeowner's insurance refused to cover the lawsuit because it arose from my employment. The district refused to provide legal defense because I'd violated policy. I was looking at potentially millions in damages if the parks won. And Thomas said they probably would win because Melissa's injuries were catastrophic and permanent. Her lung capacity would never recover fully. She'd need oxygen support for the rest of her life. Someone had to pay for that. And their lawyers were building a case that included everyone in the decision-making chain. The district offered me a deal 3 weeks after the fire. Resign voluntarily, accept responsibility for violating protocol, and they'd provide legal defense against the park's lawsuit as part of a global settlement. If I fought to keep my job, I'd be defending 2 separate actions simultaneously with no institutional support. Thomas Wu looked exhausted when he explained this to me. He said in 30 years, he'd never seen the district move this aggressively to destroy a teacher who'd tried to do the right thing. David Huang was promoted to department chair within a month. The district issued a commendation for his attempt to maintain calm and follow established procedures during the crisis. His AP Calculus students, despite their hospitalizations, had all chosen to retake their exams when they recovered. The district praised this as evidence of the school's commitment to academic excellence even in the face of tragedy. David gave an interview to the local paper about the importance of following protocols and maintaining order during emergencies. I hired my own attorney with money I didn't have, taking out a second mortgage on my house to cover the retainer. Rachel Brennan was a plaintiff's attorney who specialized in whistleblower and retaliation cases. She listened to my story for 3 hours, taking notes and occasionally swearing under her breath. When I finished, she said the district's behavior was textbook retaliation for making them look bad by highlighting their dangerous policies, but she also said proving retaliation required showing that my actions were protected, which was complicated when I'd violated a written policy. The park's attorney deposed me 6 weeks after the fire. 4 hours of questions about my decision-making process, my knowledge of the policies, my physical interaction with David Huang. They had security footage blown up to show me grabbing his arm. They had statements from students saying I'd seemed panicked and out of control. They kept asking if I thought my actions had been reasonable, or if, looking back, I could see how waiting for official confirmation might have led to a calmer, safer evacuation for everyone. Rachel Brennan filed a counterclaim against the district on my behalf. Wrongful termination, retaliation, creating a dangerous work environment by implementing policies that prioritize test security over student safety. She subpoenaed all internal emails about the testing protocols and found a goldmine. Multiple teachers had raised concerns about the evacuation verification requirement. The district safety officer had written a memo saying the policy created unacceptable risks. All of it had been ignored because the superintendent was facing pressure about declining test scores and suspected cheating. The story changed when those emails became public. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a rogue teacher violating protocol, but about a district that had knowingly implemented dangerous policies. Local news ran segments on the emails. Parent groups started organizing. The State Board of Education announced an investigation into testing protocols across all districts. Dr. Patricia Vance, the superintendent, issued a statement saying the emails were being taken out of context and that student safety was always the top priority. But the emails were damning. One from Principal Garrett to Dr. Vance said explicitly that he was concerned teachers would hesitate to evacuate during testing periods if they thought it would invalidate their students' scores. Her response was that maintaining test integrity was essential for the district's reputation and that teachers needed to exercise judgment about what constituted a real emergency versus a disruption. The state board investigator wrote in her preliminary report that this language essentially instructed teachers to gamble with student safety. David Huang's deposition was scheduled for a Monday morning 3 months after the fire. He didn't show up. His attorney called 30 minutes after the scheduled start time, saying David was experiencing a mental health crisis and needed to postpone. Rachel Brennan objected, arguing this was a delay tactic. The judge gave him 2 weeks. When those 2 weeks came, David's attorney withdrew from the case entirely, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. David sent me an email at 2 a.m., the night before his rescheduled deposition. The email was rambling and clearly written during some kind of breakdown. He said he couldn't sleep anymore, that he kept seeing Melissa Park's face when they'd loaded her into the ambulance, that the commendation from the district felt like a noose around his neck. He said he'd followed the protocol exactly as written because he thought that was what good teachers did. He'd heard the alarm and checked his phone and started calling the office like he was supposed to. When the phone didn't work, he'd waited because the protocol said to wait. When he'd seen smoke, he'd convinced himself it was from outside, that evacuating would cause more chaos than waiting for official word. He wrote that he'd been replaying those minutes every day for 3 months, the exact moment when he could have chosen to evacuate but didn't. The seconds ticking by while his students coughed and smoke filled the room, the look on Melissa's face when she'd collapsed. He said he'd told himself he was following protocol, maintaining order, being a professional, but the truth was he'd been scared of getting in trouble, scared of invalidating test scores and facing the superintendent's disappointment, scared of being seen as the teacher who couldn't handle pressure during testing week. The email ended with David saying he was going to tell the truth in his deposition, that he was done letting the district use him as an example of proper procedure when 7 of his students had been hospitalized because he'd prioritized test security over their lives. He said he knew this would destroy his career, but that he couldn't protect the district anymore. Rachel Brennan forwarded the email to the park's attorney within an hour. David's deposition became the cornerstone of their case. Watching David Huang testify was surreal. He sat in that conference room and methodically destroyed the district's entire defense. Yes, he'd received the protocol emails. Yes, he'd understood them to mean test security was the priority. Yes, he'd seen the smoke and heard the alarm and chosen to wait because that's what the policy required. Yes, he believed following that policy had directly caused his students' injuries. No, he didn't think his actions were reasonable in retrospect. No, he wouldn't make the same choice again. Yes, he believed I'd saved his students' lives by forcing the evacuation he should have initiated himself. The district's attorneys tried to rehabilitate his testimony on cross-examination, but David wouldn't budge. They asked if he thought the protocol was reasonable given the need to prevent cheating. He said no policy that makes teachers choose between test integrity and student safety is reasonable. They asked if he felt pressured to testify against his employer. He said the only pressure he felt was from his conscience. They asked if he was coordinating with my attorney. He said he'd never spoken to Rachel Brennan and was testifying voluntarily because 7 teenagers had nearly died in his classroom while he'd worried about test scores. The district settled the park's lawsuit 2 weeks later for an undisclosed amount that court observers said was probably 8 figures given Melissa's lifetime care needs. As part of the settlement, the district agreed to eliminate the testing protocol and implement new emergency procedures that gave teachers full authority to evacuate without verification. They also agreed to mandatory training on emergency response and an independent safety audit of all district facilities. The parks issued a statement saying no amount of money would restore their daughter's health, but they hoped the changes would prevent other families from suffering similar tragedies. My case was still pending. The district had technically fired me by then, following through on the termination after I'd refused their resignation deal. Rachel Brennan argued that David's testimony proved I'd acted reasonably and that the district was retaliating against me for exposing their dangerous policies. The district argued that regardless of whether the policy was flawed, I'd still violated it, and that organizations can't function if employees ignore directives they personally disagree with. Both sides filed for summary judgment, asking the judge to rule without a trial. The judge denied both motions and ordered mediation. We spent 9 hours in a conference room with a professional mediator, while the district's attorneys and Rachel went back and forth on numbers and terms. The district offered reinstatement to a different school with no back pay and a permanent letter in my file about the protocol violation. Rachel countered with full reinstatement to Lincoln High, 3 years back pay, removal of all disciplinary records, and a public statement acknowledging my actions had saved lives. We were millions of dollars apart on damages. The mediation broke down around 7 p.m. when I told Rachel I didn't want to go back to teaching in the district even if we won. The thought of working for Dr. Vance again, of sitting in faculty meetings led by administrators who'd tried to destroy me for doing the right thing, made me physically ill. Rachel said that was understandable, but walking away meant giving up leverage. I said some things mattered more than leverage. The district's attorneys looked relieved when we left without a deal. The trial started 4 months after the fire. Jury selection took 3 days because so many potential jurors had opinions about the case from media coverage. We ended up with 12 people who claimed they could be impartial, though I saw several of them nodding along with Rachel's opening statement about institutional corruption and retaliation. The district's opening was all about the importance of rules and the chaos that results when employees decide which directives to follow. Rachel built our case around David Huang's testimony. She played video of his deposition where he admitted the protocol had caused him to endanger his students. She called the district safety officer who'd warned against the policy in his memo. She brought in an expert on evacuation procedures who testified that my actions were consistent with best practices and that the verification requirement was contrary to every established standard for emergency response. She showed the jury emails from Dr. Vance prioritizing test scores over safety concerns. The district's case focused on my violation of protocol and my physical interaction with David. They called teachers who said I'd seemed out of control that day. They showed security footage of me grabbing David's arm and pulling him away from his phone. They argued that even if the protocol was flawed, the proper response was to raise concerns through channels, not to unilaterally decide to ignore it during an active emergency. Their expert testified that my actions had created panic that could have led to a stampede more dangerous than the fire itself. David Huang testified live at trial. He'd lost weight since his deposition and looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the school year. He told the jury about the seconds he'd wasted waiting for confirmation while smoke filled his classroom, about the moment when he'd realized his students were in danger, but he'd still hesitated because the protocol said to wait, about Melissa Park collapsing and him finally understanding that he'd prioritized his career over her life. The jury was silent when he finished. 2 jurors were crying. The district's attorney tried to discredit David on cross, but it backfired spectacularly. She asked if he was testifying for me because he felt guilty about his own decisions. David said yes. He felt tremendous guilt. And that guilt was why he couldn't stay silent while the district blamed me for saving the students he'd endangered. She asked if he'd coordinated his testimony with my legal team. He said he'd never met me outside of school and was testifying because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the legal implications. She asked if he expected anything in return for his testimony. He said he expected to be fired, but would testify anyway because 7 teenagers deserved better than his cowardice had given them. My testimony took a full day. Rachel walked me through every detail of that afternoon. The alarm, the dead phone, the smoke, the decision to evacuate. The moment I'd seen other classrooms still full of students. Running back inside, finding David on his classroom phone with students coughing behind him. The physical interaction that the district characterized as assault. The explosion. Getting everyone out. I kept my answers short and factual, letting the timeline speak for itself. The district's cross-examination tried to paint me as someone who thought I knew better than established procedures, but Rachel had prepared me well enough that I stayed consistent throughout. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Rachel said that was good, that it meant they were taking it seriously and probably fighting about damages rather than liability. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon. Liable for wrongful termination, liable for retaliation, liable for emotional distress. 7 figures in compensatory damages, 6 figures in punitive damages. The jury foreman read the verdict without emotion, but I saw several jurors looking at the district's attorneys with expressions that suggested they'd wanted to award even more. The district filed an appeal within the required 30 days. Rachel said they'd keep fighting for years if necessary, trying to reduce damages and avoid setting a precedent that gave teachers authority to override safety protocols they felt were dangerous. The appeals process would be expensive and exhausting. I told Rachel I wanted to settle if they made a reasonable offer. She said I'd earned the right to hold out for everything I said. I was tired of fighting and just wanted to move on with my life. The settlement came together over 6 weeks of negotiations. The district agreed to pay my full damages plus legal fees in exchange for me waiving the right to reinstatement and signing a standard non-disparagement agreement. They also agreed to establish a safety fund in Melissa Park's name that would pay for annual emergency preparedness training for all staff. Dr. Vance resigned 3 days after we finalized the terms, taking a superintendent position in another state where the controversy wouldn't follow her as closely. David Huang was fired 2 weeks after the verdict. The official reason was budget cuts requiring a reduction in force, but everyone knew it was retaliation for his testimony. His union filed a grievance, but David told me privately that he didn't want to fight anymore. He'd said what needed saying. 7 kids were alive because someone had finally forced an evacuation, and he could live with himself now, even if it meant his teaching career was over. He took a job at his brother's restaurant and stopped responding to media requests. Principal Garrett survived the scandal somehow. The district determined that he'd been implementing policies set by the superintendent and couldn't be held individually responsible for their consequences. He was quietly transferred to a different school in a different part of the district. Lincoln High got a new principal who immediately revised every safety protocol and made emergency response training a monthly requirement. The new principal asked me to come speak to the staff about my experience. I declined. Melissa Park returned to school after 6 months of recovery. Her parents had negotiated accommodations that let her keep up with her studies despite needing regular oxygen support and missing school for medical appointments. She gave an interview to the school paper where she said she didn't blame anyone for what happened, that it was a systemic failure, not an individual choice, but she also said she wished the adults in charge had prioritized student safety over test scores. The article was picked up by national education publications. I didn't go back to teaching. The settlement money meant I didn't have to work immediately, and the thought of walking into another classroom made my chest tight. My therapist said I was experiencing trauma responses related to the fire and the legal battle. She suggested I take a year to process everything before making career decisions. I took her advice and spent the year volunteering with an education policy advocacy group that worked on safety regulations. The State Board of Education issued new guidelines 2 years after the fire. Districts were prohibited from implementing any policy that required teachers to seek verification before evacuating during an emergency. Teachers were given explicit authority to make immediate safety decisions without fear of disciplinary action. Standardized test scores could be invalidated if necessary to ensure student safety. The guidelines were unofficially called the Lincoln High Rules, though the board never used that term in official documents. David Huang's restaurant job turned into a management position and then part ownership. He told me over coffee 3 years after the fire that getting fired was the best thing that could have happened to him. He'd been miserable teaching, stressed about test scores and college admissions and district politics. The restaurant was simple: cook good food, treat customers well, make enough money to pay bills. No protocols that made him choose between doing his job and protecting people. I envied his peace but couldn't relate to it. I still dreamed about smoke and alarms and students coughing. Melissa Park graduated on time with her class. She'd been accepted to several colleges with full scholarships, becoming a minor celebrity for overcoming her injuries and maintaining academic excellence. Her speech at graduation talked about resilience and the importance of speaking up when systems fail people. She thanked the teachers who'd fought to protect students even when it meant sacrificing their careers. I wasn't there, but someone sent me a video of the standing ovation she received. Rachel Brennan took on 3 more cases involving teachers who'd been disciplined for violating problematic school policies. She won 2 and settled the 3rd, building a reputation as the attorney to call when districts retaliated against employees for prioritizing safety over rules. She asked me to testify as an expert witness in several of these cases. I agreed when I could, figuring my experience might help others avoid the years of legal hell I'd gone through. The settlement money ran out faster than I'd expected. Lawyers' fees, medical bills from stress-related health issues, the general expense of not working for 3 years. I got a job with an educational consulting firm that helped districts develop safety policies and emergency procedures. The irony wasn't lost on me, getting paid by schools to fix the kind of problems that had destroyed my teaching career. But the work felt meaningful in a way teaching hadn't toward the end, when every fire drill became a referendum on my professional judgment. I ran into David Huang at Melissa Park's college graduation party. She'd invited both of us, making a point of saying we were the reason she was alive to graduate. David looked healthy, happy in a way I'd never seen him when he was teaching. We talked for an hour about everything except that day. When we finally did bring it up, he said he'd been wrong to follow the protocol, and he'd been wrong to file that complaint against me. I said we'd both done what we thought was right with the information we had. He said that was generous, but we both knew he'd chosen wrong and I'd chosen right, and 7 kids had almost died because of his choice. Melissa graduated with honors and got accepted to medical school. Her parents credited her near-death experience with focusing her goals and teaching her about the fragility of health. I watched her walk across the stage at graduation and thought about how different things could have been if I'd waited for verification like the protocol required. Maybe everyone would have gotten out fine anyway. Maybe the smoke would have killed students in multiple classrooms. The hypotheticals were endless and useless, but I thought about them anyway. Thomas Wu retired from his union position and started teaching classes on employee rights and workplace retaliation. He used my case as a primary example of how organizations protect themselves by destroying whistleblowers. I sat in on one of his lectures and felt strange hearing my experience presented as a cautionary tale for aspiring teachers. He told them to document everything, keep personal copies of all communications, and remember that institutions will always prioritize their interests over individual employees. The students took notes like he was telling them how to survive war. The consulting firm promoted me to Director of Safety Policy after 5 years. I developed a reputation for creating protocols that balanced legitimate institutional needs with employee authority to respond to emergencies. My standard recommendation was simple: trust the people on the ground to make decisions, give them clear guidelines but ultimate discretion, and support their choices even when they're wrong, because the alternative is hesitation that kills people. Some districts implemented my recommendations. Others thanked me for my input and kept their problematic policies. Rachel Brennan called me last month about a new case. A teacher in a different state had violated protocol to evacuate during a gas leak and was facing termination. The circumstances were almost identical to mine. Rachel wanted me to testify about the psychological impact of being punished for protecting students. I agreed immediately. Some fights don't end just because you survive them once. You keep fighting because the system hasn't changed enough and probably never will completely. But every case that gets media attention, every teacher who fights and wins, or even just fights and loses publicly, moves the needle slightly toward a world where protecting students matters more than protecting institutions. David Huang sold his stake in the restaurant and went back to school for social work. He said teaching had taught him he was good at helping young people, but that he needed to do it in a context where he wouldn't be forced to choose between their well-being and administrative demands. I understood that completely. We meet for coffee every few months now. 2 people bonded by surviving a catastrophe we handled differently, but that marked us both permanently. He's happier than I've ever seen him. I'm still working on getting there, but at least I can sleep most nights without dreaming about smoke. Melissa Park is in her second year of medical school, specializing in emergency medicine. She says she wants to be the kind of doctor who makes split-second decisions that save lives, who doesn't wait for confirmation or approval when patients need immediate help. She credits her injuries with teaching her that hesitation kills, and that sometimes the right choice means breaking rules. I see echoes of that afternoon in her career path and hope she never faces the kind of institutional retaliation that punishes people for acting when action is required, but I also know she'll fight if she has to, because surviving one catastrophe teaches you how to survive others. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.